So my name is Faluke Nunn, and I'm a community organizer with AFSC's Atlanta Economic Justice Program. I've been with AFSC since December 2017. And today I'll be talking about the Millennia Companies, which are a collection of affiliated companies with a track record of bad practices in their affordable housing developments. This is a long and sometimes complicated story, so I'll welcome any questions at the end about any details that aren't clear. And you can go to the next slide. So before I get into some details about Millennia, I'm going to start by talking about how our program made contact with Millennia in the first place, which is through Forest Cove. So Forest Cove is a 396 unit project-based Section 8 complex in Atlanta. Some Forest Cove residents reached out to our partner organization, Housing Justice League, that we as AFSC worked very closely with in early 2018. And since then, both of our organizations have developed relationships with the tenants there. The residents reached out because of the living conditions in Forest Cove. And as you can see from these photos that I've included, the property is in a severe state of disrepair. There's mold, there's rodents, there's leaks, there's structural instability, there's crime. Pretty much any severe housing issue you can think of, Forest Cove has. It had been neglected for years. And it's not habitable. So right now, Forest Cove is going through a transition. There's been a lot of developments over the past few months that I'll get into more toward the end. And the residents are about to be relocated off site so the property can hopefully be redeveloped. So our top priority right now is ensuring the smooth relocation and making sure that the property is redeveloped so that the residents have somewhere to move back to. Because something else that I should say at this point is that Forest Cove, it being 400 units, and also the fact that it's a mix of 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, it's extremely difficult. It's hard enough to find affordable housing in Atlanta, and it's even more difficult to find 3 and 4 bedroom affordable housing options in Atlanta. So if Forest Cove was lost then and not rehabilitated, then that would be a major loss when it comes to the affordable housing landscape in Atlanta. Go to the next slide. So how did Millennia come to be involved with Forest Cove? So Forest Cove used to be owned by a company called the Global Ministries Foundation, which was a slumlord that had multiple properties around the country. I believe that Global Ministries might have owned Forest Cove for maybe 4 or 5 years, something like that. And so then in 2016, HUD forced Global Ministries to sell its portfolio to Millennia. And actually, an interesting side note is that Senator Marco Rubio was the person who took the lead on getting Global Ministries out and bringing Millennia in. And in 2015, Frank Sanito, who is Millennia's CEO, had given Rubio's campaign the largest possible individual donation. So take what you will from that. But so the portfolio transfer began in 2016, and starting in 2017, Forest Cove was managed by Millennia, but it was still owned by Global Ministries until last April, when Millennia finally completed the purchase. And so Millennia has maintained that once it bought Forest Cove, it could relocate the residents and begin working on the complex's rehabilitation. And so the residents waited years for this process to begin. That's where we enter the picture, is when residents were waiting for something to happen. And so the complex was just sitting there. Millennia was neglecting maintenance and claiming that it just didn't have the resources to renovate, well, not to renovate, but to provide maintenance services, because Global Ministries was the owner, but nobody could find Global Ministries. It was a whole mess for all these years because there was a bunch of finger pointing about who was actually responsible for Forest Cove. And then when we try to get down to the bottom of why the closing process was taking so long, all Millennia ever had to say was that it was a long and complicated process. But as I said, the closing finally happened last year, and then the relocation process started. Then it ran into some issues that I'll talk about in a little while. Next slide. So who is Millennia? So Millennia refers to a group of companies that are involved with housing management, housing development, and real estate services. They're one of the biggest affordable housing owners and operators in the United States. They're based in Ohio, and they have properties in about, I 26 states. And you can see on the map where their properties are. They're all concentrated in the eastern part of the United States. So I think total they own around 275 complexes. That number might have gone up as they've acquired more properties through the Global Ministries property transfer. But I think 222 at least of these properties receive some type of federal subsidy. So Millennia was supposed to be this hero sweeping in to take charge of Global Ministries properties. But since it took over the Global Ministries properties, very little has changed for the tenants there. And so in response to this, sometimes Millennia will say, oh, well, this isn't our mess. We inherited it from Global Ministries. But it's been several years at this point, and they've had plenty of opportunities to make changes. And in some cases, things were still bad even after Millennia supposedly rehabbed the properties. You can go to the next slide. So as I said, Millennia has a long track record of mismanagement. And so I'm just going to give a few examples. So the first example is Callaway Cove. So where you see the headline, Jacksonville family reported gas smell 4 times before explosion. There was a gas explosion that occurred at this complex. This was actually one of the first complexes that Millennia took over from Global Ministries. It's in Jacksonville, Florida. And this is just one example of, one of the issues that occurred there. So there was a family that went to the front office with complaints about a gas smell 4 times. There was an explosion that happened that injured several people. Millennia didn't do anything about it until the worst possible thing happened. And that's kind of a pattern with them where, tenants will report things and tenants will complain about things, and Millennia staff will just kind of, not do anything. Their complaints will be ignored, and then, something like this will happen. So that's one example. Another example is Gabriel Towers. So where it says Kansas City housing activists honor the tenant they say died from unsafe conditions. A tenant died after someone broke into their apartment. And one of the concerns that residents in the building had for a long time is that they don't have proper security, and there's supposed to be security cameras that weren't working. And they were arguing, well, hey, look, if this situation had been different, you all had listened to us when we had tried to voice our concerns, then the situation wouldn't have happened. And so that complex also has several other issues. They also had no AC for weeks, in I believe the spring of 2020. Tenants had the same issues as other complexes with maintenance concerns going ignored. And also tenants have faced retaliation for organizing there. Another example is Cordova Courts. So we're at the top where it says the deplorable conditions at Cordova Courts persist. That complex, so it had issues that were actually very similar to those of Forest Cove. And that is one complex that Millennia recently renovated. But I'm in touch with one of the activists, the tenant activists who live in Cordova Courts. And in one of our recent calls on the campaign that I'm going to talk about in a second, they mentioned that there are still major problems. There are still issues with mold. There are still issues with some of the structures in the property. They said that Millennia really didn't do a thorough job. And also that, this might have changed recently, but HUD still hadn't, the last time that she was speaking about it, she said that HUD still hadn't been out to inspect the property, which is another issue, is that, HUD really has done the absolute bare minimum when it comes to keeping Millennia accountable to their responsibility to maintain safe, decent, and affordable housing for these tenants. And then finally, the final example is Peace Lake Towers in New Orleans. So where it says elderly disabled residents living with no hot water. That's in New Orleans. So it's a senior complex that's also dealing with very terrible conditions. It's the same story as all the other Millennia complexes where, complaints just go ignored and neglected, and resources are not actually invested into these complexes. And actually this particular complex was evacuated last fall after Hurricane Ida due to unsuitable living conditions. So these are just a few complexes, and there are many more where these came from. And so it's been very difficult to get HUD to look at the big picture of what Millennia does. In our conversations with HUD representatives around Forest Cove, they up until now they've just focused on Forest Cove and the issues with Forest Cove, and they take Millennia at their word around what they're going to do with Forest Cove. But there's this wider problem of what they've done in complexes like these. So Forest Cove is just the tip of the iceberg. Next slide. So I also wanted to mention a few more examples of what we've been dealing with Millennia. So in addition to the living conditions that I mentioned before, of course, there's neglected maintenance requests. There's so many residents who will get in touch with us or in touch with me and say, hey, I've called the office like 2, 3, 4 times about this issue and nobody's done anything about it. And then, the office will claim that they never put in a work order. Their record keeping is not very good at all. But maintenance requests will go ignored. There's also an understaffed maintenance team. Millennia claims they've had issues hiring folks, but who knows what the real reason is. They only have I believe 2 maintenance people for the entire complex. That's part of why maintenance requests have gone go ignored sometimes, because there's only a couple of different maintenance folks. And then on top of that, the front office staff a lot of the times are disrespectful or unresponsive. And residents say that they don't feel like they take their concerns seriously, or they'll talk down to them sometimes. Also, there's no security. Residents have been asking for security for a long time because of the issues with crime, and Millennia just has not provided it. They do have security for the front office, a security car that parks next to the front office that actually, asked the group of residents. I'm going to talk about the rent strike protest that they had in a little while, but there was a group of residents who tried to deliver a demand letter to the front office. And in any other situation, security would be invisible. But security guy got out of his car and told them that they had to move along with a group of allies back across the street. And then later on, the front office called APD on the group when all they were trying to do was deliver a demand letter around rent and maintenance and security to the front office. So there's security when the front office feels threatened, but not for the tenants. And then finally, Millennia has not been transparent or honest about the relocation or redevelopment process, and they miss almost every deadline that they set for themselves. I'll go into what happened. I'll go into an example of that in a second. But first, you can go to the next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about, just give a few examples of some of our work in Forest Cove. So since we, and we being both AFSC and Housing Justice League, first connected with Forest Cove, we've helped to establish a tenants association that meets regularly. We've helped set up a system of regular communication with Millennia, including monthly calls with Millennia and HUD, which haven't been that helpful, but we're a start. We conducted a youth leadership program back in 2019 during the summertime, and then the idea was to keep that going every year, and then COVID happened, so hopefully that can be restarted in the future. And then another big something big that happened is that we won a rent strike. So what I was talking about before, basically back in January, residents sent a letter to Millennia demanding that they cancel their rent payments because they weren't getting anything out of the rent that they were paying. And with all the issues in the complex, it didn't make sense to have people pay rent to live in conditions that were threatening their lives. So they delivered a letter to the front office asking that Millennia cancel rent, among other things. And they didn't get a response from Millennia. And so then they scheduled a protest to deliver a letter saying that they would just not pay rent. There were a couple of resident calls that were had, and the residents were like, look, we think that we need to just go ahead and stop paying rent. And, it was like, yeah, of course, So we helped them draft a letter, and the residents delivered that letter. And so that same day that letter was going to be delivered, where the residents were going to let the front office know, hey, we're going to stop paying rent. And also, I should add as well that a lot of residents at this point had already stopped paying rent because of the conditions, even before the rent strike was announced. But the owner, while the residents were out protesting, in the middle of the protest, sent a letter agreeing to their demands and saying, okay, look, you won't have to pay any rent until you're relocated off site. So that was a very big win. You can go to the next slide. So I mentioned before that Millennia finally bought the property in April 2021, and which paved the way for them to relocate residents and then rehab the complex. So the initial stages of the relocation process began last summer, and Millennia began having meetings with residents, identifying units and lining things up to move them off site. And they were just waiting on the approval of their tax credit application that they had with the Georgia Department of Community Affairs. And those credits would fund both the relocation and the renovation process. And Millennia maintained that they absolutely needed the tax credits for this process to happen, which by itself should have been a red flag. But at that same time, the city of Atlanta had a suit against Millennia because they had found 150 code violations during an investigation in summer 2021. So in December of last year, a judge ruled that the property should be condemned. And then this decision made DCA decide not to award Millennia the tax credits, and the future of Forest Cove was thrown into limbo. So I should also note here that Millennia never gave any indication of the deal being thrown into jeopardy until the 11th hour. And residents were left wondering what happened when the relocation process paused abruptly. We actually had a call with the residents in HUD and Millennia, one of those monthly calls, the week that everything came out, that the deal was not going to happen. The Millennia representative was on the call saying that a deal was imminent and he was in talks with DCA and the city of Atlanta. And then we find out a few days later that everything had fallen apart. And a lot of residents had been in the middle of relocating, and they were saying, look, like the front office won't answer my calls anymore. They had told me that I had to pack my bags and be ready to move. And now all of a sudden I'm not going anywhere. What's going on? It took Millennia way too long to get to send the residents any communication about what was happening. So Millennia is challenging the city's condemnation order in court, but they were just given the green light after a lot of discussion back and forth by the city to continue with the relocation process so that the residents don't have to suffer in their units while they wait for the outcome of the case. So the residents will be moved, but the big question is, where will they come back to? If Millennia wins the case and gets the tax credits back, they could be brought back to a renovated Forest Cove. But the city is also considering developing another site. So the city of Atlanta is also considering developing another site that it owns across the street that was torn down over a decade ago. So if that works out and Millennia does not get the tax credits, then it's possible that the residents could be brought back to that site. So the relocation appears to be on again, which is really, really good. But where they'll be brought back to is still up in the air. Next slide. So despite the pattern of issues that Millennia has in complexes around the country, as I said before, HUD has been useless when it comes to holding them accountable. So I think I also mentioned this before, Millennia has just been dealt in a very piecemeal, complex by complex way. But in order to truly make an impact, you need to look at the big picture. So a group of folks who are affiliated with different Millennia complexes have been meeting to create a campaign to fight for the rights of Millennia tenants around the country. And our demands will be focused on HUD and what they can do to better regulate both Millennia and also other repeat bad actors. And so we hope to officially launch this campaign soon, and I'll make sure that AFSC and its networks are notified when we do. Next slide. So once the national campaign officially launches, we'll come out with a list of actions the public can take. But in the meantime, here are a few things that you can do if you're interested in taking action. So you can contact HUD directly and tell them to launch a national investigation into Millennia, and tell them that you're concerned about the actions of Millennia and their impact on their tenants. You can also contact your congressional representatives in the House and the Senate and tell them to put pressure on HUD to launch a national investigation. This is something we're trying to do in Atlanta right now, and we're thinking that now is a pretty good time to bring people on board and like call attention to millennia, given what's going on. Like Forest Cove has been getting a lot of attention locally, and there's also a lot. I've been told there's also a lot of interest in Congress right now about the actions of bad landlords due to a couple of different tragedies that have happened, including the fire in New York. So now would be a good time to contact your representatives and urge them to pay attention to this issue, especially if you live in a millennia city. And you can figure out where they have complexes on their website if you Google the millennia companies. And then finally, if you like to keep up with the Forest Cove Tenant Association, you can follow Forest Cove Tenants on Instagram for updates. You can go to the next slide. So if you'd like more information, so I just, everything that I said really is just the tip of the iceberg. I was trying to give enough background for folks to kind of understand the gist of the issue, but some more in-depth information can be found in these two resources. They're a really good starting point. So the first is an essay by the Houston Chronicle called "Living Hell." It's pretty long, but it's well worth the read. They talk about a few different millennia complexes in different cities. I think in Texas and Florida, in Missouri, and maybe in one other place that I'm forgetting, and talking about their similarities and some of the corruption that millennia have been engaged in. And then also there's a series that just came out around Forest Cove by WABE, which can be found at that link, just wabe.org/Forest Cove. And you can learn more about the Forest Cove story and, and follow. I think that some updates are being posted on their site as well. So again, these are just two really good sources to start with. So it's wild. It's already been 23 minutes, but I'll stop and see if there are any questions. All right. Well, if there aren't any questions, then I can go ahead and close out. I guess if you'd like to contact me, or if you live in a millennia city and you have, I should have put my email down. But if you live in a millennia city and you would like to talk more about millennia or Forest Cove, you can email me. My email is just my first initial and my last name. So F as in Frank, NUNN @afsc.org. I'd love to hear from you. I do see one question around when does the national campaign start? So we're hoping to launch it within the next month. We don't have a specific date yet, but we will definitely keep you all posted. So yeah, thank you all again for your interest and for tuning in. And yeah, I hope to hear from you. Hope you have a great rest of your day.